partners at Liturgical Press. We are delighted to have you with us as we celebrate the publication of John Sweeney's James Martin, S.J. in the Company of Jesus. John's book is part of Liturgical Press's People of God series, which highlights the life and works of important Catholics. And that series now includes the life and work of America's very own Father James Martin. John Sweeney. John Sweeney, who is the publisher of Paraclete Press, is a longtime friend and contributor to America, and his recent work has received praise from individuals ranging from Mary Carr, the poet, to Father Ronald Rollheiser. We are glad to have you with us this evening too, John. I also wanted to welcome a special note of recognition to Susan Braddock, the chair of America's Media's Board of Directors, who is with us this evening. As well as several other directors who are here with us tonight. I'd also like to recognize Nancy Della Valle, the chair of the Board of Advisors of Liturgical Press, who is here with us. And also members of the media and Friends of America and Liturgical Press. Finally, I would like to welcome everybody who is attending via the live stream, tuning in throughout the world for this evening's discussion. Welcome and thank you for viewing. I have known Father James Martin for 15 or 16 years now, and in describing his work here at America over 22 years, I find that a baseball metaphor is in order. Father Martin has very much been for us a utility player. In his time with us, he has served as associate editor, cultural editor, publisher, treasurer, and now editor-at-large. To us, his colleagues and friends, he has served as a mentor, an editor, a chaplain, an inspiration, and most of all, a friend. Regardless of how busy he might be, whether writing or editing a new book, preparing for a pilgrimage to the Holy Land, delivering a keynote address, administering the sacraments, or soliciting an essay for America, Jim has always stopped for those around him to check in, to pray, to care. I can think of few more fitting people to profile in this People of God series. I'd like to now turn things over to my colleague, Kerry Weber, executive editor of Here at America Media, who will be moderating this evening's discussion between John Sweeney and Father James Martin. Kerry.
Thank you very much, Tim. As Tim mentioned, my name is Kerry Weber. I'm an executive editor here, where I've worked at America for the past 10 years, and I've had the privilege of working alongside Jim for that entire time. And I think a way that I would like to get started is, John, I think Tim mentioned a number of reasons that he thinks that Father Jim might be a great candidate for this book. Why did you think so?
I can't think of anyone in the church today who would be more recognized, more honored, of course, and also occasionally reviled. But James Martin has done so much in his career. The conversation that I had at the Frankfurt Book Fair when we decided to do this book kind of went like, have you considered James Martin? And they said, well, he's awfully young, isn't he? And I said, well, I think he has a body of work that is substantive and long-lasting, and a reputation in the church worldwide and beyond the church, out to the boundaries, that deserves, attention and will get all kinds of attention. And then when I turned to Jim and asked him what he thought, his first response was to question his vow of humility. Is it possible that this could be done? And then I remember that he did the own calculation of his age. You said, well, when would the book come out? Or, how long would it take you to write it? When would the book come out? And the book would come out in 2020, and I remember you thought to yourself, oh, well, at least I'll turn 60 in the year that comes out. 60 is, it's not the biblical year exactly, right? That would be 70 or 120. But at least he would be 60, and that somehow communicates some sort of gravitas. But I think that Jim's life, ever since the beginning of his discovering his vocation, and the way in which he has told his story and has encouraged all of us to understand our own stories and our own lives with God, made him such a, frankly, easy topic for this series.
And Jim, you had initial skepticism, if your biographer here is correct. And can you tell us what made you think, beyond your age, that this might be a worthy project for you to be a part of?
Yeah, this whole thing is an exercise in like challenging my humility, basically, including tonight. So about 2 years ago, another colleague and friend, Jim Keane, who is here, our literary editor, was asked by Orbis Books, the publishers here, Robert Ellsberg, to do a collection of essential writings. And I kind of had the same response to Jim that I had to Jon, which was, I'm not going to prevent you from doing it, right? But I'm also not going to say, yes, I am a spiritual master, or yes, I am deserving of. So I said to Jon, I'll give you all the stuff that I've written and all my books, and I'll open up friends, that you can interview. My family's here; they're happy to be interviewed, and you can interview me. But I will only check the book for accuracy's sake, But then, can I tell about our conversation?
Well, you've already said this much, so go ahead.
So I wanted to Kerry. We're all very friendly here at America. I went to Kerry and I said, "Guess what?" And she said, "What?" I said, "You know that People of God series? One of our other editors had written one on Oscar Romero." I said, "They're going to do one on me." And the quote was, "That's ridiculous."
Part of my job description is to keep Jim humble.
So I said I wanted that for the blurb on the back. "That's ridiculous. Kerry Weber, senior editor, American Magazine." So
I also had concerns about your age. You have a lot left to do.
So I tried to stay out of it as much as possible, and Jon, I think, did a good job, and I reviewed it for accuracy's sake, which was, I think, a good thing to do. But anyway, I try to stay out of it. It's embarrassing, to coin a phrase.
Now, Jon, it's no easy task to write, just a standard magazine profile of someone who would read it and be around to respond to it. But to write a book-length project on an individual whom you know fairly well and who certainly would be around to react to it, seems to me that it might be a bit nerve-wracking, right? To really get into the real nuances of someone's personality and their life and their work, and to still have that person talk to you at the end. So were you nervous about approaching this project with someone with whom you did have a good working relationship?
I think I only would have been nervous about it had I been intending to critique Jim in a way that I was never intending to do. I mean, I'm a fan of Jim's, and I think that comes through in the book, and I wouldn't have taken it on if I wasn't a fan of Jim's. There have been some sort of infamous literary biographies where the subject was there's one about Graham Greene. I can't remember the author, where it was very clear that the author really hated Graham Greene's guts and took on the project in order to sort of take him down. So I mean, I would never want to write such a book or take on such a project. You spend so much time working on a book that just wouldn't be good for the soul. So I knew going into it that I had affection for Jim, respect for Jim. However, I did try to throw in there a few little spots where I critiqued him in little tiny ways.
Would you like to highlight them here?
Please focus on those.
Well, no.
Let's continue down that
I don't
line.
remember them specific. I mean, I remember when he was a young priest. There's somewhere in the book where I highlight some things that he said in print, and I suggest that this reflects his youth as a priest at the time. And some of his culture criticism was a little strident in the early years, and I remember that as being one example. I revealed a typo in one of his tweets. That was quite something, wasn't it?
It's devastating.
Yeah. Yeah, he has trouble handling criticism. So anyway, I've already forgotten the question, but it was a joy to work on, and he made it so easy. In part because he's written about his own life as vocation and pilgrimage in such a way that I had that raw material to work from. And then I had him alive. It's good that he's only 59 because he's still around, so I was able to email him all the time and say, is this true? Is this right? Is the nuance here correct? And there was a period of time when I was probably emailing him almost daily, and since he has a job where he sits at a desk a lot, he responded really quickly, and that was very helpful. So he made it very easy.
Now, Jim, you, as Jon mentioned, have written quite a bit of your own work about your own life. And was it hard to then sort of turn over your story to somebody else and let them tell it in a way that maybe would be different from how you would tell it?
Yes. I'm used to, a lot of the work I do is memoir, theology through memoir, narrative theology, some people call it. And so you have a certain control over what you tell people and what people, what you share. And yeah, I found it interesting, the stuff that he focused on. Jon focuses a great deal in the book on the writing, a lot of the writing at America. But I knew that, it's his perspective. I mean, I have zero distance from this story, so I had to trust him. He's a very good writer, and he's written a lot of other great books that I've liked myself, and so I have to say I was happy when Liturgical Press assigned him, because I knew he'd do a very good job, and you did. You've done a very good job, so I wasn't too upset about it or too worried about it. The beginning of the book, I think, makes me smile. If I can, I felt like I was reading Abraham Lincoln's autobiography. If you don't mind me, it's beautiful, but the house Jimmy Martin grew up in 107 Kings Road in Plymouth Meeting, Pennsylvania, and I thought, it's like Harry Truman or
Carl Sandburg.
So it's strange reading about yourself in that way. Anyway.
I do think you did a really wonderful job, Jon, of highlighting Jim's work and the sort of progression and the work ethic that he has to have grown in his vocation as a writer and in his vision of his writing as a ministry. Now, you yourself are an extremely prolific author and writer, and I wonder if there's anything that you sort of learned from about that you could apply to your own writing or your own work from studying his work so closely. Was there anything about the process or the content that struck you that you've been able to kind of take into your own life?
I don't know if I learned something to apply to my writing so much as I was humbled at what I don't do in my writing. I did not realize, well, let me back up. I had read, I think, most of Jim's books. There were a couple of the little ones that I had not read before I started the project, and then I reread everything. So I knew his work pretty well, but of course I read it with a different eye the second time. And then I read or at least I was just telling a couple of folks on staff here who prepared this incredible file for me of everything Jim had ever published anywhere in print or online, because it had been printed out and stuck in this file. And I at least turned every page and looked at every single page of these things. So I got pretty familiar with what Jim's work was. And I was humbled by how, again and again, his writing is for other people. Because my writing is not often for other people in the same way. He's continually, when he's writing about himself, it's easy to critique a memoirist and think that they're self-centered or something. But this one is not. I mean, he writes about himself because he's trying to pull out of other people what they can discover in themselves. And it's always about sort of self-discovery and finding God in your life. Spiritual direction through writing is what he does. So that humbled me because I don't do that.
Well, it's interesting because to me, when I was thinking about the process through which you went to develop this book, there was an examine-like quality to it in my head where you were sort of guiding him through these elements, not just of his day, but his life, and asking these questions. And I wonder if the process of Jon drawing out these events of your life over the course of the emails or several months led you to find God in your life in places that you had not originally thought there was a sort of sense of consolation. Was there anywhere that you had a experience that you did see God where you hadn't previously?
That's a great question. Yeah, I would say Jon pointed out something that I think is actually true. And when you write a memoir or a book, you write it as the person you are at that point. So I wrote a book called In Good Company in 2000, I think, that was about my entrance into religious life from leaving GE to entering the Jesuits. And when I wrote it, it was very critical of corporate America. It was very critical. And then 10 years later, I did a 10th anniversary edition, and I could see how, it wasn't very balanced. And, because there are a lot of friends of mine who are still in GE and are still working and are still finding business a vocation. And so I think with distance, you can see a little bit more of, yourself writing at that time, right? That was the person I was at that time, kind of critical and judgmental. And I think the one thing that really surprised me, and I thought, that's interesting, and my family's here, they can tell you, my sister's here. I think a lot of the stuff that I'd written had been the sort of trope was, not very religious boy, adolescent, young adult becomes religious adult. That's kind of the classic conversion story. Maybe that was influencing me. But reading the book, thinking maybe I was more religious than I thought I was, right, in terms of praying and going to church. And there's a line in there where you say, well, he couldn't have been that unreligious, if he was experiencing these things. So it's I always saw my childhood and my young adulthood as occasions of grace, but I wonder sometimes if I went back and met myself in college or at GE, if I would say, oh, this guy's actually pretty religious. He goes to Mass every Sunday, and so it's interesting. It's an open question. Yeah, interesting perspective. You can, like I said, ask my sister. She's here. So
I've given her an extra 20 minutes for the Q&A at the end.
Please don't go that far.
Jon, was there something that you discovered that may have surprised you in Jim's early life that was maybe indicative of the kind of ministry he works in today, whether through his LGBT ministry or his writing? Something that struck you as like, oh, you know what? Looking back, that's sort of a prediction of who he's going to become.
I'm not sure. It was fun to look at his college life.
It was fun to live it.
And one of the regrets that I have about the book is that I wish it were longer. I think Jim knows that. We had some conversations about that early on. It's longer than the other books in the series that it's a part of. And that was because I was sort of insistent that it had to at least be of a certain heft. But I would have wished it would be 30, 40% longer, and then I would have delved into a lot of things that I just had to pass over in a paragraph. So you get Jim's college life in about a page and a half, maybe. I don't even remember. 2 pages, maybe. It's ridiculous.
To quote me.
Exactly.
That's ridiculous.
That's
Kerry
ridiculous,
Weber.
Kerry Weber. So, but looking at his college life, and even before that, looking at his school life, it was interesting to see that he was always the character that I think we know who know Jim. I mean, the room is probably full of people who know Jim. Winsome, personable, funny as hell, smart as can be. I'm sure he was always the guy in the room who was the funniest and the smartest. And there's a funny interview that I did for the book. The other Jesuit, whose name I don't remember, but your good friend who was in the postulancy with you.
Bill Campbell.
Bill Campbell, I interviewed, and he's quoted in the book as, really despising Jim at the beginning. And he says something like, I can't even get a word in edgewise, especially when we're in a group of people. He dominates the conversation. And I sort of imagine that it's not necessarily that he's dominating the conversation perhaps arrogantly, but his personality probably fills the room in a way that Bill's maybe, shrunk into the corner a little bit. Later they became...
No, I was pretty arrogant. 27, full of myself. Yeah.
But I think I sort of wove some of what I was intuiting about Jim's personality from the beginning of his life, and I saw it in his writings. So I think that's how I'd answer your question. The humor, the way in which he approaches a project, his determined way of getting so much done, his hardworking qualities, his message in his Jesus book, his willing to walk into the fire on building a bridge. So that was kind of fun to see, and I felt like I sort of saw the range.
I'm smiling because I called Bill Campbell, who's my novice mate, my classmate, as we say in the Jesuits, and I read him that, the passage that he gave you from his journal. We were howling. We were like, my God, we were terrible. Yeah, we were both, we're both 27-year-old novices and full of ourselves, and we're very close today, so we were literally howling on the phone.
Jon, you mentioned wanting to have the chance to maybe expand on Jim's college life. Are there other parts of the book that you think, what's another
Lots.
example of something that you would have loved to have more time with?
I would have interviewed a whole range of other people if I would have had the space to do it. There's a lot of interviews I didn't do just because I knew I didn't have the space for it. The book is about 60,000 words, and it really ought to be 90 or 100,000 words to be the kind of biography that I like to read anyway. So, I mean, I didn't even give you any of Jim's grades in college, or, you know. I remember when he was in, was it at Weston, where I make a remark that you really enjoyed your feminist theology class. Yeah, yeah. But that was it. I mean, it's almost like a throwaway line. He really enjoyed his feminist theology class. I would have interviewed some of his professors a couple of them are still at Boston College, for instance. I would have told more of the story. I just would have filled out a lot more detail instead of moving through things so quickly.
Well, Jim, what are some parts of your life that you were most eager to kind of return to through this process, and perhaps less eager to return to through the process?
Wow. Yeah, honestly, you can ask my sister again. You know, reading about my childhood, I find always very warm and wonderful. We had a great childhood growing up. It was kind of Brady Bunch childhood. And also, I was really glad you put in there, which is very important to me, and I think people are surprised when I say that I did it. I worked for 2 years in Africa with the Jesuit Refugee Service, and that was a really important part of my life that I think, you know, the question about, you know, what might have prepared me for the work with LGBT people is working with people on the margins like that, and it was tremendously important for me and really shook up everything that I understood about this country and about poverty. One funny thing, I'll tell you this, John said to me, do you have any journals or letters that I could read? And I said, sure. And I looked through a couple journals, and I thought, I don't know about my prayer journals, but I'll give you my letters. And, you know, whatever 1990, you wrote, some of the young people in the audience, you wrote actual letters, like an actual letter that you would send back. And so my mom, who's watching, hi Mom, in Philadelphia, my mom had saved all my letters from the novitiate and from Jamaica, where I was working with Mother Teresa's sisters as a novice, and from Kenya, a lot of my letters from Kenya. And then also, people will remember this custom of trading cassette tapes back and forth, you know. So when I was in Kenya, I would record a long hour-and-a-half cassette tape, and I would take like a tour. I would say, I'm driving through this slum. Here's the refugee I'm interviewing. It was, you know, it was kind of fun. It was like doing like a little show. And I would send it back to my mom. Well, we still have them. And so I gave them.
Look out for the America podcast.
That's right. So I gave them, you know, because I'm a busy guy and I trust him. I gave them sight unseen to John. I just said, here's some from Kenya, here's some from Jamaica, here's this tape. And, you know, it was an interesting exercise because one tends to look at one's, you know, past, I think, through mainly rose-colored glasses, at least some of us do. And I had this kind of image of myself in Africa, so, oh, man, I was just so. And the letters that he quoted is like, 10 more months, you know, and it's like, wow, you know. Now, part of that, I was going to tell you, part of that might have been in deference to my mom and dad, saying, I'm really looking forward to coming back, you know. So I was thinking that might have been an element of it too, and my sister too.
Clipping toenails.
That was something I probably would want to go back to. When I was in, that has always stuck out for me. When I was in Jamaica as a novice, part of Jesuit training is to work with the poor, of course, throughout your formation. And one of the things that I was asked to do with Bill Campbell, was to go to Kingston, Jamaica, and work with Mother Teresa's sisters in Our Lady Queen of Peace, and then also teach boys at an orphanage called Alpha Boys School. And my job, which he recounts in Jamaica at Our Lady Queen of Peace, was to bathe and shower and shave old men, you know, who were dying basically, and help them in the shower. I'll just say this, and you know, wash them everywhere, and clean up the toilets when they overflowed. And, you know, Ignatius calls it low and humble tasks, and it certainly was. And they would sometimes blow their nose on you in the shower. And you can ask my family, I'm pretty squeamish. And so at one point, I also had to clip their toenails, you know, because someone has to clip them. And I just found that the most difficult, probably the most difficult physical thing I've ever had to do, just in terms of it being kind of gross. And I remember one time and they would also, it was actually kind of funny. I'll just tell this funny story. There's this one guy whose name was Ezekiel, and he always wanted his nails clipped, every day. Clip my nails, brother, clip my nails, brother. So I would come and I'd clip his nails. And then he would say, I can still hear him, they're very scratchy. File them. And I finally said to him, I don't even file my own nails. But I did it for him. But one day, this was kind of a turning point in my life, just like where I've gone, I would say. I was scrubbing the floor because the toilet had overflowed. I will leave the rest to your imagination. And I was all wet, and my assistant novice director, David Donovan, who some of you know, came down, and he looked at me, and he said, if your friends from Wharton could see you now. And I thought, yeah, but I'm happy. I'm even clipping toenails and scrubbing up the toilets. I was happy doing what I was doing, and really at peace. But I never want to clip toenails again.
Now, Jon, were there any parts of Jim's life that you were particularly excited or anxious to explore? Anything that perhaps you thought, now that I am in this, I've known Jim for a long time, but in this context as a journalist, I get to ask him X, which maybe I wouldn't have in otherwise polite conversation.
I guess I did that a bit. The only category that comes to mind where we did some of that was that I would challenge you occasionally on an article you had written, or in more recent years a tweet that you might send out. And in fact, while I was writing, it took about a year and a half to work on the project. While I was writing, there were a few occasions when the moment after he sent a tweet, I texted him and said something like, aren't you going to get into trouble for saying that? Or did you just phrase that in a way that you really considered the way that you ought to say it? Was that a little too, I don't remember, suggesting that I don't even remember. I shouldn't even offer a possible example, but I'm sure it was political on some occasions, reminding people that we do believe in an afterlife and that sort of thing. And in every occasion, and that's the kind of thing I would always want to ask someone like Jim, but you don't get to ask that unless you're writing a book about him. And in every occasion, I was sort of surprised and kind of impressed at the way in which he felt completely at ease, both with who he was and what he had to say and what his role was, and in his confidence of what his superiors, if necessary, would have to say about it. So that's the thing that comes to mind. The thing that comes to mind that I enjoyed working on and thinking about and talking with Jim about is that we share a couple of things in our past, and it was fun to explore that. One of them is Thomas Merton. We both have a great love for Thomas Merton, and Merton had a big impact on us. So part of Jim's story is that in late 1986, he comes home from work from GE, he turns on the TV, he's tired, he probably has his TV tray and his TV dinner in front of him. That detail's not in the book.
Spaghetti and meatballs. FYI.
Out of the can, or?
No, it was reheated. I remember.
See, this is the kind of detail that I
yeah.
wanted to have in the book.
I was sitting on a couch with a bowl of spaghetti and meatballs in my lap.
See, I didn't
watching,
know that. I should have asked.
In Stamford, Connecticut. And
anyway, and on public television comes the Merton documentary by Paul Wilkes, which had a big impact on me too. For him, it was in 1986, and at exactly the same time in 1986, I was reading Merton like crazy. I was visiting the Abbey of Gethsemane thinking, should I become a monk, and so on. So we share some of that. A few years later, I lived in Boston, and I met Paul Wilkes, and I met Basil Pennington, who was the star author of Pat Kosman, who used to be the literary editor of America. So we have some of these things that we share. Jim was a student at Weston Jesuit. In the very early 90s, my first job in books, one of my first jobs in books, was that I ran a theological bookstore in Cambridge, and one of the things that I did was I sold the textbooks for Weston Jesuit and Boston College summer school, summer institute. So anyway, it was fun to explore all those things and kind of relive some of that stuff, because he and I share some of that. And it's not like we had sat around and, I don't know, we had talked about, I'm sure we had talked about Merton, but we hadn't talked about much of that. And it was fun to explore it in the form of writing about Jim's life.
Thank you. And now I'll have one final question for you, Jim, before we go to the Q&A. If you could write the next chapter of your own biography, which you're living into now, what would you want to see covered in that?
Oh my gosh. What do I want the rest of my minute?
Just the next chapter. You don't have to cover the rest of your life.
Wait, that's okay. I'll wait. Yeah, maybe I'll try yours. Well, gosh, that's a great question. So
Anything in your ministry that's coming up?
That's coming up. So I have a book that's coming out on prayer that I just finished last week called Learning to Pray. That'll be published by Harper One in another year or so. And I'll tell you, since, what the hell, I was kind of thinking of, this might be a little more sharing than you're used to, but on my retreat last year, I was kind of thinking it's not exactly time to, in any way, end the LGBT ministry, but I thought maybe it's time for kind of a shift. Do you know what I mean? Not like I'm going to stop doing it, but maybe kind of an interior shift towards other ministries. I have a book on Lazarus that I want to do, I hope. And I was praying, and I said to Jesus, as one does in prayer, I said, I think it's time for me to kind of move on. How would you feel about kind of this interior shift? And Jesus, I imagine him saying in prayer, why don't you leave that to me? And I thought, okay. It was pretty clear, too. It was one of the clearest things on the retreat. And I told my spiritual director, and he said, well, it's good to leave things up to Jesus. And, so that was in the summer, and I kept getting invited to do more and more talks, and my sense is that there are a lot of great people who do this kind of ministry, New Ways Ministry, and all sorts of great places, Fortunate Families, and a lot of great individuals, Janine Gramick, and, tons of people on the local level, tons of people. There aren't too many priests doing it in the particular way that I feel like I've been called to do it. And so people keep asking me to do things. People keep asking me to Skype in with them or give talks, or I get a lot of questions about advice. So it seemed like the ministry was continuing. And then I'm on this dicastery for communications, as you know, and I was in the Vatican, and I ended up being invited to meet Pope Francis, and we talked about this ministry explicitly, and he was very, I'm realizing we're live streaming, so I can't say too much, but he was very supportive about continuing this kind of ministry in peace, right? And it connected. I thought, well, I've sort of left it up to Jesus, and now I feel like I've gotten a response from the Vicar of Christ, right? And so it really felt like a kind of invitation to this next chapter. And one of the things we're doing, which I think a lot of people here know, is we're starting to, we've organized a conference for people who work with LGBT Catholics in the church at Fordham, which will be next June. And so that feels like kind of the next step in this ministry. Because one of the things I realized kind of going around the country was that there are a lot of places that do great LGBT ministry with Catholics. I mean, really terrific. Right here in New York, I can tick off, Church of St. Paul the Apostle, Church of St. Francis Xavier, St. Ignatius Loyola, I mean, on and on and on. But they're often unconnected to one another. And then when you go to, say, the Heartland, right, and there are places where maybe there's one person who does it in a parish, this woman or man doesn't know anything about Church of St. Paul the Apostle or Fortunate Families in Atlanta or a Glow ministry in Chicago, and I thought it'd be great to really bring them together. So we have this coming up, and and who knows where that will lead? I mean, who knows? I mean, I think a national network of people who minister to LGBT Catholics is essential. It's also, it's very threatening for people. But I see a lot of change. Just Sunday, I was speaking to all the Catholic college and university presidents in D.C., that's a big, that's a big change for them. So who knows? I mean, when Pedro Rupe, the former Superior General of the Society of Jesus, was once asked, I love this example, or this answer, he was once asked by a journalist, where is the Society of Jesus going? And he said, I have no idea. So, it's up to the Holy Spirit. So, yeah. And she usually does a good job. So.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you, Jon. Thank you, Jim. We really appreciate your time. We have time for a few questions from the audience. Nick Zwicky will be bringing the microphone around. Please raise your hand and wait for the mic. Yes, Robert Ellsberg.
Uh-oh. My former publisher.
Future publisher.
Very good.
like the Pope, you have a lot of
Can you actually, just for the audience, can you identify who you are?
I'm sorry,
I
I'm
think
Robert Ellsberg.
people
I'm
would be
the
interested.
publisher of Orbis Books, and I
Author of All Saints.
He's,
Well,
qu-
that
he's
was-
quoted in the book, too.
Not in the
Robert.
index, though. Interesting. I looked that
Is
up.
that true? Talk about
My
ego.
copy is defective, I think. I've already tweeted out a complaint to the publisher about that. We published Jim's first book, or This Our Exile, and we also did the famous Modern Spiritual Masters. And so, by extension, just because I know you, and I see a lot of the hate on you in Twitter and Catholic media and the press and that sort of thing. And I really wonder how that affects you, and what are the kind of Ignatian resources that allow you and the Pope to deal with that kind of thing? Huh?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, I would say this. One of the key things for me was 5-6 years ago, I was doing a retreat, and I was praying over the passage of the rejection at Nazareth. You all know that story. So Jesus is in Nazareth. He gets up in the synagogue. He says, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me," and the crowd initially likes him, but then they turn on him and they drive him to the brow of a hill, and they want to kill him, basically. They want to throw him off. And this passage often comes up, and when preachers expand on it, it's usually from the perspective of the crowd. I'm sure you've all heard homilies like this. You know, how often do we too miss God in front of us because God, it's too familiar, right? And what familiar people in our lives are, that's, I don't mean to denigrate that, but that's the typical homily. And so I was praying over this passage, and I noticed that Jesus, which I had sort of found out from researching this Jesus book, was in Nazareth, which is 200 to 400 people. It's a very, not much bigger than this crowd, right? It's Nazareth. And I was amazed that he was able to stand up and do this and say this in front of people who he knew and whose reactions he could anticipate, right? If you stand up in front of a crowd of people you know and you say something controversial, you know how they're going to respond. And I said to Jesus in prayer, how were we able to do this? And the answer I heard, one doesn't often hear answers like this, as succinctly, was, "Must everyone like you?" And at the time I would have said yes. But it felt like an invitation to let go of the need to be loved and liked and approved of. And I didn't quite know where that was going at the time, right? I said, oh, that's interesting, that kind of freedom. And then, 5 years later, there's all this pushback from this book and real hatred, kind of personal vilification. And I mean, the names, it's, faggot and fairy and heretic and apostate and sodomite and all these kinds of things. From people online, but also, sometimes, and still, I got attacked by, a bishop or two. And so what happened was, I think, meditating on that story and meditating on what Ignatius calls the grace of indifference, right, the detachment from that need to be loved, brought me to a place eventually where I was pretty free of that need, right? So that's one part. That's kind of the spiritual thing. Another part that happened was, I would say, in my religious order, I realized that my superior general supported me. My provincial has been tremendously supportive. My Jesuit brothers, it was like maybe one or two that had a question, but all the rest of them were tremendously supportive. The people of God. And so I started to think, who cares about these hateful, homophobic people who are mainly online? And, who cares? I mean, so I told Pope Francis this. I said, I don't normally use that sentence, but I said, it took me 30 years to get to the grace of indifference, but, was worth the wait. So now it doesn't bother, truly, and I think I've told this to Robert, it really doesn't bother me. And you can ask my sister, would have bothered me 20, 30 years ago? Would have bothered me 10 years ago? It really does not bother me. So the other day, without naming names, a bishop, critiqued this conference we're doing. And, I would never say anything negative about the bishop or anyone else, but I would say, with all respect to the bishop, it didn't bother me. Like, it didn't make a claim on me. I didn't lose any sleep. I thought, okay, I'll write to him. And, maybe for a half an hour, I was a little annoyed. But, in the end, I thought, okay. And I didn't lose a wink of sleep because I feel like I'm doing the right thing. And I feel like Jesus, if he had waited for everyone in Nazareth to love him or like him or approve of him, he would have never gotten off his butt, or would have stayed, sawing wood. So it's detachment. It's the Ignatian gift of detachment, which is a grace. You know, I mean, you have to be open to it. But yeah, so that's kind of how I see things.
Thank you, Jim. Other questions?
From any of my other publishers that are here?
Yes.
Hi, my name is Rudy. Question about the title, In the Company of Jesus, Mr. Sweeney. Because SJ is Society of Jesus, is there a play on the words, or?
That's all it is.
Curious.
Yes, it's a play on the words. I thought it was descriptive of what Jim's life has been about, and it was a nice play on the words.
Nick, how much time do we have left?
One more
One
question?
more question. All right, we have one more question.
Don't be shy.
Carolyn, this is your time.
That's right.
That's
Or
Jim's
my
sister.
nephews? Do my nephews want to ask a question? No, good idea.
All right, well, that's it. Thank you very much. We really appreciate your being here.
Thank
Thank
you.
you again,
Thanks.
Father Jim and Jon Sweeney.